Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to this latest webinar from Quantuma. My name is James Ashton. I'm a financial journalist and author. I'll be your chair for this morning's discussion. Please send any Q&As in as we go, and I'll try to get through as many of them as I can before our 10:30 finish. So this morning's topic, fractional ownership. It seems to be everywhere these days. You can buy a slice of a private jet, a rare stamp, or a property development as easily as gambling on Bitcoin. But unlike Bitcoin, property schemes in particular are often marketed as offering steady but above average investment returns. Plenty of examples of these schemes turning out to be nothing but scams. And while regulators remain behind the curve, hoodwinked investors face a trail of disappointment and advisors have to step in to try to salvage something from the distress. I'm here today with three experts in this session to explore fractional ownership in property, what's going wrong, how advisors pick their way through a minefield, and what needs to change. So our three experts are Simon Campbell. He's a managing director in restructuring and insolvency for Quantuma based in Southampton. His sector experience includes technology, property, professional services. He works with directors, lenders, and other professionals when they're considering what's the best path towards corporate recovery. Also from Quantuma, John Maclean. He's a director and restructuring and corporate finance specialist based in Glasgow. His expertise includes advising on distressed real estate ventures, working alongside planning consultants, property agents, and developers. And joining them is Paul Muscutt. He's a partner at Crowell Moring's corporate group based in London. His practice covers all aspects of contentious and non-contentious insolvency, with a focus in the banking and asset-based lending sectors. Welcome all three. So let's get into this world, John. It seems like we have schemes that we're going to talk about over the next hour because banks that were lending into this space up to the financial crisis decided this was an activity for them coming out of the financial crisis, and other people stepped in. Is that how you see it? How you've seen this develop?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you draw a line in 2008, pre-2008, development finance was relatively easy to get, and in fact, in many instances, banks were prepared to lend 100% of the costs of a development. That was fine in a boom. When the boom ended, most of the banks found themselves with quite substantial exposure to commercial and residential property in a market where values were dropping almost catastrophically. Obviously took a few years to come out of that, and one of the alternative sources of finance that emerged was this idea where people could almost club together to provide development finance or finance to buy an asset of whatever sort. That would then almost act as seed capital, which could be used to effectively kickstart a development process that banks would otherwise not fund.
Because it's fair to say, I mean, as you allude to it, these pooled investments, these collective investment schemes that are used across many aspects of finance, they're not always a bad thing. The thing we're really focused on is the unregulated collective investment schemes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger in these schemes is that you become almost complacent about your involvement in it, and people focus on returns without really understanding the risks. And one of the key criteria of these schemes, one of the things that hooks in investors, is that there's always a promise of a rate of return which is by some distance more significant than they would get in a bank or any other financial institution. So, 8%, no risk, guaranteed, all these words tend to be all that investors see. Unfortunately, we have to deal with what happens when these things don't quite work out as guaranteed.
And do these schemes, so as you say, look, this is annual returns of 8 to 12%, no risk, don't worry about it. Where do I sign? People typically buying a lease within a property or a chunk of a property. It could be student accommodation, serviced offices, multiple occupancy, even a car park. Mm-hmm. Is there any other variety? I mean, that seems to be, they seem to all have that in common. There's not particularly any variety between the student accommodation or the car park.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar sort of model. I mean, I think in a certain sense, what the asset is almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
This is about return. Friends of ours, I got a phone call from a friend who asked me about a 50 grand investment they made in a marijuana farm in Ghana, and asked me if they thought they'd lost their money. Well, I mean, there's no easy answer to that. But these schemes are not all that different. People are throwing money into a void, and they don't really know whether that money is going to be spent wisely or not.
I suppose there is a very flippant answer about going up in smoke, but I'm sure that's not the one that you gave, John. Simon, let me turn to you. You've been in this world. You've covered a number of these cases. Given what you can do with fractional ownership in aviation and other sectors, is it ever legit in property, or is it always a cover for a scam? In your experience,
in my view, it is always a scam, but that is because I sit at the bottom end of the business cycle, watching things come in. I would imagine that these things can be run reasonably well if the business plans are sensible and the rate of return is reasonably modest. I had one director who I think was fairly legitimate, who said that when I asked why he went for a 9% model, he said, well, everyone else is doing it. And so he was driven to offer 9%. So can I just go back to the point about distinction of the properties, just a brief distinction, which I think is important. It is where some developments have a central facility and have to be run collectively. And what I mean by that is the quite obvious situation of buying a hotel room or a nursing home room, where the central operation has to be run together. If you buy a flat or perhaps a student dwelling, then you could possibly run it on your own, but you can't possibly do that on a hotel, etc. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. And we'll come on to more about the structures and in a little while. But Simon, also is it possible to generalize about the type of investor? It seems like this is a retail investor, and I use the word hoodwinked at the top. So I'm interested in your view on that, and then also the type of operator. Who are the people who are laying on these schemes?
Well, the investors are from all over the place. A lot of the investors that I see are coming in from the Far East and from the Middle East and from India and Pakistan. But that, I would have said in my experience, about 50-50 with local UK-based investors. They tend to be at the top end, high net worth individuals who are fed up with the bank rate, and at the bottom end, people who have received their lump sum payment for a pension and have wanted to do something clever with it. So in terms of the people who get involved, the unifying elements seem to be some experience in development and the ability to sell. So otherwise, no particular comment on these people who are putting forward these schemes.
Yeah, Paul, the legal perspective. We know this is immoral, but to be clear, as we set out in this conversation, what is the illegal aspect?
Well, the potential illegal aspect is where these scheme operators are operating, as we touched on earlier, what's called a collective investment scheme. And that involves features of where you have investors participating in profits. These investors, especially as Simon said, where they're in the Far East, they're not going to have day-to-day control or management of the property, and where there's a potential risk of their funds being pooled by these scheme operators. I think in those situations, it falls in danger of being a regulated activity under the Financial Services and Marketing Act. And in order to be a regulated activity conducting it, you should be a regulated party. And where the scheme operator, people selling these things, are not regulated, then that could potentially be a criminal offence under the Act. So I think that's the illegality of it. But each scheme differs. They may not be a collective investment scheme. And I think, as Simon touched upon, the feature where you have student accommodation potentially, or flats where there's not a common central function in the building that needs to work, and these investors could, in theory, operate the property themselves, then it may not be a collective investment scheme. So it's not straightforward, but often these features are not set out in the documentation, the brochures that investors get. As John rightly said, they only sort of see the return aspect and the exit features in the document. They don't actually look at how it's going to operate. And some of these operators don't put in there how it operates. And even if they do, doesn't mean to say they actually do that. So as Simon will find out, when these things go wrong, what they said they did and what they actually did could be two different things.
I mean, as you say, it's highly technical, and I mean, you know, for example, the FCA says it does not regulate, it does not oversee unregulated collective investment schemes, but it does regulate their promotion. And then it's a question, I guess, of whether they're promoting to the man on the street or to a ultra high net worth individual.
Yes, and that comes down to how these things are sold. And you know, in my experience, that there is a very expansive network internationally of property agents who promote these things. And those property agents are conducting a regulated activity potentially if they're promoting and selling these things. And what if those agents aren't regulated? Well, then that restricts, if it is a collective investment scheme, that restricts access to compensation by the FCA. So I think the selling and promoting could potentially be illegal, but most times it's a network of small agents around the world who sell these investments to members of the public.
And as Simon says, I mean, is there scope, do you think, well, you know, sometimes there are people in this world who, and it's very difficult to get our arms around it and say, for example, how many of these schemes are operating and the value of money going into it every year and so on. But there are people within this world who are kind of swept along for the ride. The people who might otherwise have offered a scheme with a 5% return feel like they've got to offer this unattainable 9, 10, 11% just because that's where the market is.
Yes, but I suppose you really have to look at the underlying business model. I mean, if you're renting hotel rooms in care homes, how can you get a static 8 to 10%? And what happens if you don't? And I know we'll come on to that, but it is a risky investment.
It's not like me to give people the benefit of the doubt, but there you go. So, and John, you agree with that? So in terms of your experience, it's roughly 50% UK money, 50% overseas money that's coming into these schemes.
Yeah, I mean, we have dealt with a number of the people who promote these schemes, and they have an international network of referrers. It's quite interesting to speculate on what's happening from a money laundering perspective with this money coming in, but you know, it is quite a weight of money. We've been specifically engaged in projects in Liverpool and you know, on 3 or 4 schemes that we are aware of. There's about 100 million of investment that's come in, and good chunks of that are coming from China.
Interesting, yeah. And Simon, so when you first observe one of these things, what do you see as warning signs when one of these schemes is going wrong, or do you always get involved a bit too late? The warning signs have gone off if you're in the room.
The warning signs have definitely gone off when they come to me. Normally you have a group of investors who've been furiously WhatsApping each other and haven't received rent for a couple of quarters, say, what's going on. Sometimes the developer is proposing an alternative arrangement. Sometimes the scheme has just collapsed. It's not financial distress. These people are relying on this income and it's not coming in. That's generally the position. In terms of the instance where the developer has stopped working because the building is incomplete, then exactly the same. But the investor is in a much more difficult position. They haven't completed on their lease. They have simply thrown money at something where they have no guarantee, as much as a guarantee may not be worth anything anyway, and they do not have a lease either. Different circumstances, same issue. Money's run out.
But there always is an asset at the heart of this. It's not simply a mirage.
There is always a building at the heart of it, but the asset may be beyond the grip of secured lenders as well, and indeed smaller investors.
Yeah. We have a slide which we can put that up now. That'd be helpful. And this is a generic scheme, John, and we've drawn this up. And maybe you can just talk us through what looks like my untrained eye to, it's kind of like Russian dolls, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that complex is not it's not going to be in the forefront of an investor's mind, because people in our game looking at that can see the cracks in the pavement and can see where problems might arise. But essentially, what we have there, there is a developer who is responsible for building out the project. And I think, going back to what you were saying about warning signs, I think it would be important to stress that these are very often quite complex buildings that are being built, and typically by people who don't have a great deal of experience in building complex buildings. So that is a huge warning sign. There will be then a complicated structure of leases, which Simon can talk slightly more to, involving a freehold, which essentially sits underneath the building, if you like, and then head leases and investor leases. And the problems that we've faced professionally are all in that space on the right-hand side.
Where in particular? So the investor owns a lease beneath a head lease, but then I guess the typical challenge is that the money's paid out to the investors should be coming from rental income, but then kind of unbeknownst to them, because they didn't maybe read the small print, there is ground rent and all sorts of other stuff to come in. So gradually the scheme just runs out of cash. Yeah,
well, you as an investor don't really care about much other than you've paid 100 grand for a property and you should be getting 8 grand back in a return, less costs. The question is, who owes me that money? And that's where the fun and games comes in, because it's not immediately clear who it is you've got a beef against in that structure, because there's a detachment from the developer to the lease.
Tell me where, look, I'm fascinated that furniture leasing comes in there as well. Why is that so important?
Shall I take that? I mean, the issue is that the developer has gone here. The developer has made his money from the sale of the investor leases. And what he's set up is a structure where he's brought in probably a quite legitimate freeholder who's just interested in the ground rent. But when we get appointed, we are appointed over the sublessor, who is the guarantor of the rent. And what the sublessor can't control is the block management there. So drawing the distinction with the control of the flat or the student apartment in this case. And I have to say, there's all sorts of variations on this, but I think this structure sort of demonstrates some of the problems that you have. If I'm put in as administrator of the sublessor in this case, who owes the money to the investors, there's a lot that I can't control here. So with the ground rent heads up towards the freeholder there, and the head lessor still controls the fabric of the building. And within that fabric of the building, there are all sorts of costs which the head lessor can control. I've put in the instance of furniture leasing. All the furniture in the student accommodation is leased out, or it could be laundry or gym equipment, etc. The specific instance that I'm perhaps talking about here is that where the block manager and the rental agent, when I arrived, were the same people. But I could control one because I was nominally, I could control the money because I was nominally appointed to nominate the rental agent, but I couldn't control the block manager. And it becomes a really difficult arm wrestle to try and gain any control for investors because they simply haven't looked at the structure of their advisors haven't looked at the structure of the position here to understand who controls what.
And they haven't looked at this. I mean, how many of them have actually been to the building, Simon? Do they, you know, the ones in the UK? I guess you find most of them.
Very, very, very
yeah.
few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, John, I think there's an instance where you did go to look. You told me you looked at a car park on behalf of someone recently. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I stay not far from Glasgow Airport, and it's still subject to what sounds like a truly horrific insolvency, but there is a piece of ground with 1,060 car parking spaces in it, and those car parking spaces are owned by, let's say, 1,060 individual investors spread all across the world. They all paid 25 grand for a car parking space. So you effectively have a piece of ground that's probably worth, as a bit of property, a few £100,000, but has actually been monetized to generate 25 million. And just from a practical perspective, how do you as an investor know what's happening with your space?
Great. I think we can take the slide down now, please. Paul, I suppose the word we haven't said yet is Ponzi. I mean, there is something about these schemes, it seems, where the investors are continually recruited and the money keeps flowing out, and it's a case of one trying to keep up with the other. I mean, are these always Ponzi schemes, or is that just one thing that they try on?
Well, I think it's a risk, James. If you look at the business model of this, if you take a property, for example, in order to sell those rooms, that there will be commissions paid to agents, and we've seen commissions that as high as 30%. So immediately a cost comes out of the investor's initial money. The building, as a freehold without any leases, will be worth a sum of money. But once you've sold all the leases, it's worth a lot less. If the building's a hotel or a nursing room, depending on the occupancy levels of that building, the income it generates have to meet a very high cost, because it has to pay the commissions of setting up the scheme, the cost of running the hotel, and then it has to pay the rents to investors. But invariably, certainly in the schemes that we have seen, not obviously, as Simon said, we only see the downside. But when the schemes come to us, there's insufficient money to meet the trading costs of the hotel before you get to the rent. So therefore, investors are wondering, well, how have we received our rents? And there's no big, the operators that we see are not big conglomerates with huge reserves, cash reserves. There's no extra money here. The money is only the money the investors have put in. So in order to pay that rent, we see that the rent has actually been paid from investors' own money. So the new investors are actually paying, the old investors are actually paying the new investors' rent. So as you say, a Ponzi scheme. And some of the directors of these schemes do admit that as well. They said, well, you know, that's how it had to work in the initial stages. But again, there is no secret pot of money here. You know, the money comes from the exploitation of the business, whether it be a car park, a hotel, or a care home, and that has to meet very high costs.
And one example which Quantum was involved in as administrator is A1 Alpha Properties Leicester, which has been written about widely in the Financial Times, and this adds a bit more color, I suppose. I mean, here there were 1,500 investors, there were Facebook ads, there was a showroom in Dubai, a payment missed in October 2019. This was about student rooms in Stoke, Bradford, and Leicester, and so on. And simply the ground rents and there was a network of development companies. Ground rents and service charges outweighed incoming rents. Seemingly 100 million went in, and almost all of it was spent. So, you know, a mess there to resolve. Simon, I'm interested. I was going to ask the question, but Dan Geddes has beaten me to it. Investors are presumably more likely to claw something back if they work together. Do you have any tips on how investors can contact each other and how they can work together to salvage their investment? You've already mentioned WhatsApp, so this seems to be how they're talking to each other.
Yes, you're not talking to a technology expert here in how to communicate with each other, but you're right about working together. One of the things I look for when I take a case on is the togetherness. Sorry, poor word. Togetherness of the investor body. Another thing is a bit of experience amongst them of legal matters and accountancy and property. and a general sense of purpose, and not just the overwhelming, sort of anger that something's happened, but the determination to do something about it. So I think you have to be very organized as a group of investors. In the case of Alpha, which was an extensive group of 19 student properties and had other related enterprises attached to it as well, it's extremely difficult to get. It was actually 2,200 investors together, but we managed it, we facilitated it to a certain extent, but it has to come organically. Originally from the investors, a desire to get things done, and you need some leaders in there, a sensible messaging system, and people who are prepared to put their hands in their pockets initially in order to get something done.
I take no joy in the FT getting their numbers wrong, by the way. But as you do that, and it's a follow on from what Dan was asking, I was curious about. I mean, for the advisors on this call, I mean, is there a point at which you need to review and say, is this a project I want to get involved in? Because you do need a willingness on the side of the investors to get together. You hope they have a bit of nous finally, and also they need to understand that there's going to be a cost attached.
Indeed, I mean, and that cost can be set out, from all the various advisors and so on, in due course. But part of the issue is going into something where you don't quite know what the next cost is going to be. Everyone knows that feeling. Well, we pay $5,000 now. Am I going to have to pay $10,000 tomorrow? What's the process? Yeah. So, I mean, I think investors are faced with basically two issues to deal with. One is, what is the present, and how are we going to deal with things going forward? I.e., do I need to get this building built out? Or do I need to control the building so I can get my rental income? How am I going to deal with that? And then how am I going to deal with the sins of the past, if there are any? Who's to blame? And how am I going to tackle that issue? And perhaps one affects the other. But the overwhelming advice I have is, if the preeminent thing is, what is the position now and what's happening going forward, and then deal with the past at more leisure. Yeah.
I think there are some warning signs there, James, as we've seen, and I know Simon has as well, when you get these investor groups, and we've discussed it before, James, where they get infiltrated by, I would say, disruptors who have ulterior motives, and they're able to lead investors in the wrong direction, not disclosing their real involvement or motivation for being self-appointed as a coordinator of investor groups, when really they've got some quite sinister intentions behind it. So having good independent advisors leading the investors is good. And don't forget, a lot of these investors are, as we said earlier, from the Far East. Their first language in many cases is not English, so it's very difficult to coordinate. And I know some of the advisors I've been working with, called like trying to herd cats. It is very difficult because your investors going in very different directions, very distressed and concerned about the loss of sometimes their life savings, and trying to get them on a track which is the best recovery for them. It is difficult when you've got people pulling in different directions. And I think togetherness, as Simon said, it is the right concept, but in reality, certainly in my experience, it's very difficult to achieve.
And we've got that split kind of UK investors and overseas investors. I guess these schemes target the overseas investors because they're more likely to say, chalk it down to experience. We've lost this abroad. We'll be a lot more careful next time. Or am I wrong, Paul?
So in terms of the, can you repeat? In terms of
if overseas investors are as likely to want to pursue a case as UK investors?
Good question. I think some are, some certainly are, but I think we've also had people who completely disengage. So certainly we've had Chinese investors and other investors that completely disengage from the whole process, and we don't hear from them again. And that in itself makes it very difficult, because without their engagement, and these investors are owners of a lease, we have to try and deal with them without their engagement. And again, that means we have to use court action, and it becomes expensive, and also causes the other investors loss because you can't get a consensus. I think engagement with UK investors is pretty good. and in engagement with English-speaking investors is pretty good. But often we try and get an advisor or a lawyer in a different jurisdiction to be the mouthpiece for foreign investors and try and get them on board. But it is a problem. I think engagement of foreign investors is difficult.
Yeah. And Simon talked about blame. Paul, I mean, do you find that, I guess there are advisors who would have been involved in this from day one who just don't want to engage either. They either go to ground or just don't want to admit anything. And I guess you guys coming in at this later stage, that makes it even harder to find some resolution.
I think advisors at the outset, we don't see many advisors at the outset in terms of lawyers who've completely designed the schemes. But where there are advisors involved, in an insolvency, we do have ways to compel them to cooperate with us. And if we have to use those powers under the insolvency legislation, we'll use it to bring them to the table to assist. But I think we will come on to it later, the role of regulators and the role of advisors at the inception of these schemes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd just like to bring in the issue, the classic example of an advisor who may be vulnerable is one who has acted on both sides of the coin, i.e. for the company and then for the investor as well. I've seen that, and it's an obvious no-no for an advisor.
Mm-hmm. And have they, and again, I'm not trying to give anyone the benefit of the doubt, but have they done that, knowing in full that is the wrong thing to do, Simon? Or was it just, I don't know, did it ever just happen?
Cost. It's a matter of cost. And it's a matter of, well, this lawyer knows the territory already. Here's a pre-prepared lease, and if you want to ask him advice, go for it. And I'm not a lawyer, Paul. You probably better talk about that. But it just feels totally wrong. But it's about getting on with it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the law firms we see across these schemes are not large international city law firms. They are either regional practices or very small practices or essentially conveyancers. So they may not have the larger insights or visibility of FSMA and all the other regulatory issues that come with the whole scheme. And also they may not be fed all this information from their clients and the operators who may have kept a lot of them in the dark. All I can say is we don't see large international corporate city firms on these deals. Well, I certainly haven't.
No, I guess and nor am I reading it. John, a question, a home team question from Neil Allen, your colleague, wants to keep you all on the ball on this call. How do you ensure commitments from the insolvent entity to pay investor returns do not become an unavoidable expense of the administration process?
Wow, that's he knows exactly why he's asking that question, because it's something that in the design of these schemes, and I don't know whether it's intentional or otherwise, there are a number of bear traps that make enforcement very difficult. And this is one of them, that if you step into a company that has guaranteed rents of 8%, as an administrator, you become liable for the settlement of that 8%. So many IPs would walk away from that.
So it's again that judgment you have to take going in as to whether it's worth the risk to take the business, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean we're actually dealing and have been dealing with some months with a practical application of that. And essentially what you have to do is you have to have the investors surrender their entitlement to that 8%. And this goes back to what Paul was saying about how important it is to get investors to act as one, because they have to move away from the obvious and understandable anger about not getting a return to actually salvaging something out of what probably is a bad investment.
Look, I think it's a great answer. And look, if Neil had that answer, John, he'd be on the panel. So thank you for that. And your point about anger, I'm interested. I mean, look, there's all the professional skills you have to deploy when you're doing these things. You've got to be a bit of an agony uncle as well, I guess. You've got to calm everybody down.
Yeah, the starting point here is people probably think they've been duped, and nobody likes to feel that they've been taken for a ride. I think you have to get over that, and you have to salvage what you can out of it. I mean, it's not all bad news, because if you can get control of the property and can get control of the freehold, the asset is actually valuable, but there's quite a mountain to climb to get there. And in order to get there, you probably have to get over this bit of, well, who am I going to blame for this? You've got to move beyond that.
Yeah. A question in, Simon, maybe you could have a go at. What experience do you have where fractional ownership is held in a UK-based company limited by guarantee as the asset is on Cape Verde? I don't get this last part. However, the majority then held by a UK pension trust.
My answer is to take legal advice, Paul. So, I mean, that would be a classic example of, the asset being in a different jurisdiction to the the same issue that the Chinese presumably have over here, non-comprehension of the situation overseas, and the costs of doing business overseas when it goes wrong. Extremely difficult, and the more complex these people can make it, the more difficult it is to break down.
And difficult means international, I guess, Paul. I mean, the more flags on the map one of these schemes has, the harder it is to unravel everything.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good answer, Simon. I think where you have assets abroad, it might be a UK company, but equally, what law governs all the documents. And even if it's English law governing the documents, if you've got a property in an international jurisdiction, the laws about enforcing against that property and the powers of the administrator and liquidator, local law may well dictate how that asset can be realised. So it does make it more complicated. And these fractional ownerships are international. There are a lot of schemes in the US as well. And the process of how they're unwound could be very different in those jurisdictions. I think certainly for the panelists here today, I think our focus is on where the assets are in the UK. They're not all necessarily held by UK companies, but the assets are in the UK, and we can enforce and manage those assets within the UK, which is our jurisdiction.
Is it possible to say whether this, if you call it an industry, is more sophisticated in the UK, it's developed here further and faster?
I think, we touched on it in our previous discussions. I think in the UK, it's seen as a safe haven to invest in. I think a lot of these schemes where they've gone wrong, we've been lots of correspondence with the FCA on this about, is it bringing the UK's reputation as a safe investment place into disrepute by the fact these investments are able to happen and they're not being regulated and investors are losing their money? Is the perception of the UK as a safe place being affected? And I think it is. I think definitely it is.
Yeah. And that's echoed in a comment from, it's Neil Allen again from Quantuma. It appears many of the overseas investors see the UK as a safe bet, often thinking things like this cannot happen here. From a reputational perspective, does the UK have to do more to prevent things like this happening for fear it will have a detrimental effect on attracting future investments for genuine schemes? As more examples of these come to light, have you heard anecdotally that overseas investors are being put off by the failure of these schemes?
Yeah.
Simon or John?
Neil's obviously having a good time making life difficult for us. Yes, I think in terms of the UK, I think it's up to regulators to have a look at this. There's nothing new under the sun here. This is just a variation on all sorts of scams and misadventures that have gone before. What is interesting about this is there appears to be a sort of a pattern here of behaviour that seems to be quite coordinated, and most of it, as we've talked before, is quite legitimate. It's unethical. There's a lot of strong arming going on, and it's taking advantage of people who don't know enough about their investments. But there's quite often there's nothing essentially wrong. The one thing that is wrong, aside from the regulations aspect, is the question of whether the developers knew that these schemes couldn't work or not. And that is obviously a matter of judgment, and it's not difficult. It's not easy to pinpoint a legal action against these people, as that takes it takes a while and a whole lot of data and information to prove. But that is essentially what is wrong, knowingly going into it, knowing it couldn't succeed.
And we'll come on to that. What could change just for this last section? I mean, briefly, I don't know, this is a Scottish question, John. I don't know if it's for you or it's a legal question, so maybe for Paul, from Joel Conn, who's at Mitchells Robertson Solicitors. Is there anything that you can say, any differences in relation to legal issues in the Scottish market for these schemes?
I mean, from a purely operational perspective, no. I mean, the way these things are set up is going to lead to the same problem, whatever the jurisdiction. I mean, there is obviously a difference between Scots and English law, but how you enforce, how you deal with the issues are I would guess broadly similar. Yeah.
I promise you that's the last curveball for you, Paul. I'm interested in proposals to improve the situation. You've set out a few ideas, and I think written to some of the bodies. Do you want to summarise? I mean, there's the SRA, there's land registry, there's a couple of things that should be happening here to fill in these cracks.
Yes, I think so, and I think at the outset we said that lots of people running these schemes, even though there's a very real risk there could be a collective investment scheme, the operators we all see, they're not regulated. And that should immediately set alarm bells off. Why are they not regulated when there's a risk they're conducting a regulated activity? But in terms of preventing these schemes getting off the ground, and I think they are prevalent, they're seeing a lot of these being set up again and again and again, and investors investing again and again. So if you look at how they could be prevented, I think the regulators have a big part to play. And by regulators, I'm talking, yes, the FCA. I know that this is in their radar, but that their engagement and their actions against them, we haven't seen much of that. I think there's one case at the moment that they're bringing to the courts to prosecute, and we have our eyes on that to see how that's determined. But I also think the SRA, in terms of the solicitors and the same body for conveyancers, the CLC, I think they need to be tougher. They have given warning notices, and this is aimed at the lawyers that buy the leases, the rooms for the investors. So where these lawyers are given an instruction to buy a unit in a building, are they asking the right questions? Are they on notice of potentially unlawful activity? Are they warning the clients adequately in how they could lose their money? And if they're not, I think the regulatory bodies need to have quite tough sanctions against these people. We have seen on the more fraudulent schemes, law firms being set up precisely for this purpose, to ask no questions and get the transaction through, and they are facilitating these schemes. I think coming down hard on the regulators and the law firms that promote and manage and set these schemes up is important. And then more practical things, like if you look at the land registry, we're talking about big buildings that are split up into hundreds of leases. So where the land registry is receiving multiple applications from lawyers to register leases, should they not be saying, hang on a minute, we're not going to register these until we have an FCA certificate, this is a compliance scheme, and that will kill it immediately. Well, it will certainly raise questions if you couldn't register the leases. And if the law firms knew that, then before they complete on the lease, they'd be asking for their FCA compliance certificates. That's one way. And then just generally improve legislation around collective investment schemes. It'd be good to know exactly what is and what isn't. Having things determined as a CIS, that should be easier. At the moment, you have to go to court and have a declaration as a CIS. Surely there should be an easier process of doing that. And then finally, in insolvency, where Simon and his colleagues and us are trying to unravel the mess, and often we are the target for investors' frustrations for that, but we are not making it. We are trying to resolve the problem. And it would be, I think the insolvency legislation could empower us with more and better tools to help investors and deal with the leases and the assets to get a greater return for creditors.
Okay, that's very helpful. Would you agree with that that overview, Simon?
Yes, obviously, you know, I'm not a lawyer, and that all sounds very sensible to me. But I mean, the one thing I wanted to bring up was the role of the secured creditor and the structure of how things work in the UK. Obviously, a number of you know, lenders, probably not high street banks, but second and third tier lenders are involved in this as well, and probably as hoodwinked as the rest of us. And it's you know, how we bring together the secured credit, the interests of the secured creditor and the interests of the investors. If you have security over the freehold, the first thing you want to do is to sell it as soon as possible to get your money back. But what do you do if you're not going to get all your money back? And what do you do if you by selling it quickly, you sell it at undervalue? So there are a number of issues for a secured creditor, and the reason I bring that up is because if you have a debenture over a company, you can control the insolvency process. And one of the tricks that these developers bring in is they, when things are going south, they invest investors' money back into the company and take a charge and take a debenture over the company so that they can control the outcome of the insolvency. And that probably needs to be looked at as well.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just, sorry, James, can I just chip in there? Because I do think, well done, Simon, for raising the secured lender point, because I think there's a more sinister point about secured lenders in their role in these things. Because if you are a bridging financier and you are enabling the first building in a scheme to be purchased, then you must be asking, how am I going to be repaid? And what's the plan? And my suspicion in some of the cases that we've been dealing with, that certain lenders may well be aware of the scheme. They may be aware that a risk, it might be illegal, but yet they're lending. And these lenders are charging extortionate rates for that bridging finance. So these lenders are actually as culpable in some cases as the directors who have set up a scheme that they knew wouldn't work. So I think the role of secured lenders should be under the spotlight here as well.
I mean, I'll come on to a question for Peter O'Donnell, but I mean, you seem as you've talked about lenders, Paul, question for any of you. I'm interested in, if we don't get this regulatory clamp down, you know, does the growth continue? And I thought one thing that might change is, you know, do the more traditional lenders come back in? You know, you hear about NatWest now, it's all about civic duty and so on. We have challenger banks. You know, there are good banks looking for areas of the UK economy to invest in where others have withdrawn. Or is it still the very much the non-standard lenders that are occupying this space?
I personally can't see any mainstream lender lending to these schemes because of the regulatory requirements behind it. It would set alarm bells going off everywhere in every major bank, I think. And I've never seen a major bank in these schemes. I don't know whether Simon and John have.
But if there's a way of, I mean, I'm not saying using HSBC to legitimize these schemes, but actually there are things you could do to make them work in, you know, in the future. You know, if you pare down some of the sort of arcane structure and so on. But no, it's a bad idea. I got it. Let me go to Peter O'Donnell.
I think, I do think if potentially, as we touched on before, if it was a workable business model at realistic percentages, and you had a regulated party doing it and it was entirely compliant, you may well see some more mainstream lenders getting involved. But I don't think schemes work like that because they wouldn't attract the investors.
No, understood. Peter O'Donnell asks, why is no one talking about introducers in the UK, including both FCA regulated ones and the payment of secret commissions by developers? Simon or John, would you have a view on that?
Yeah, well, if people want to Google just now, you will find that there are advertisements online. I won't name any names, obviously, but there are companies who are promoting schemes right now at 8% guaranteed return for 3 to 5 years.
Heavily de-risked.
Yeah, and they will also say in those advertisements that they have diligenced the scheme and they have spoken to the developer. They know the project, etc., etc. Most of those people, if you look for their FCA regulation, they aren't registered. They are completely unregistered. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. that looks very much to me like a financial promotion, and I cannot understand what, I mean, that to me is a flag enough. And there are commissions behind that are taken up front, and they're usually quite chunky as well. And it's a bit of a victimless, well, it's not a victimless crime, but these guys are not called to account yet. They might be taking out of a 20 million project, they might be taking 5 to 10% in commission up front.
We've talked about with SRA and SCA and so on at the top level. I'm interested in what could be happening better at the local level. I mean, looking at the example of all the fractional ownership that blew up in Liverpool, and Liverpool City Council, very heavily censured for not policing these schemes closely enough. What should be happening at the local level? Because I guess these schemes need planning permission.
They do, but that doesn't stop the schemes getting off the ground. So, often, well, not often, but certainly on the ones I've seen, the planning has been largely ignored. And don't forget, where there's development, a feature of the failed schemes is the development either hasn't taken place at all, or has, you might have some fences up, but very little has been done. So by the time it hits Simon's desk and my desk, planning is still outstanding. And you're right, there may be covenants on the land that prevent splitting up. It depends on the scheme. You may have already bought a trading hotel or a care home, or you might be buying a building you're converting into that. So planning is part of it, but I think often by the time it fails, that hasn't been achieved. And even if the planning was refused, the money's already been handed over at that stage. So as part of the scheme, they haven't said, we've got planning. So it's all after the event then. But yes, planning could be refused, but that won't prevent the scheme in my experience.
Simon, do you agree? I mean, it seems, so the planners are just unsighted.
Yes, they don't do their due diligence enough. I can't second guess the motivation of local government, but it seems to me like there is a bit of corruption going on there. I can't put my finger on it, but people who shouldn't be developing stuff are developing stuff because of their connections, both in local government and the various people who are prepared to put together, professionals who are prepared to put together dodgy schemes, and that includes local government as well.
There's very often a regeneration angle in this, and what you have is a council that's desperate to bring some brownfield site back to some sort of commercial use, and because of that, I think people put blinkers on, so that the development in itself is reason enough to support it.
So it's levelling up. It's the sort of you've got a scam in Derby, I want a scam in Manchester. So everybody is drawn to these schemes if there is that carrot that it will actually improve the city centre. I can see it.
It's a quick fix because again, one of the features that people probably should be on the lookout for is that you won't find, just as you won't find mainstream banks, you won't find mainstream developers doing this either. So you're not going to see a Taylor Wimpey as a lead contractor on this, because they wouldn't get involved in a scheme like this, because quite simply the money runs out. Yeah.
And final point, Simon. So what is the takeaway for advisors and people on this call, either when they're taking on the work of one of these schemes, or it's a real slog to bring something to fruition, I guess.
The takeaway, don't get there in the first place. So I mean, when I arrive, if I'm looking to sort out a situation where in the first instance an unbuilt site, I'll be looking for a bunch of investors who are up for it. The investors need to stop the moaning for a bit, and then put together a plan. And that plan must involve, can we afford to build this thing out? What are the consequences of it? You need some legal advice for that. You need some property advice. I will provide the insolvency know-how, but they need to get themselves organized to make the best of it. And that requires a huge amount of, as we said, togetherness. And you need to set up a new company you need to have a decision-making process. One of the issues that we have is obviously As Paul said, you've got your Chinese investors who perhaps aren't involved in the process, although a lot are. And you have to build a consensus. What I like to see is at least 50% of the investor body involved in going forward. I think then I, as an insolvency practitioner, have legitimacy to deal with these people to try and make something of it. If I only have 20% of people, then it's very difficult to say that they are any different from any other person who wants to buy this property and carry it forward. So unity is and advice, and being able to have a bank account to pay for your valuation advice for your builder, your initial works, etc., incredibly important, but and extremely difficult from ground zero, where you're just left with disappointment, having lost 50 grand or whatever it is.
Okay, right, fantastic. I think that's a good moment to draw things to a close. We really hope you found this webinar useful. From my point of view, I think it's a fascinating topic. I can see lots more fallout from the lack of oversight of this activity. If you want to carry on the conversation, we're putting a slide up now with contact details for Simon, John, and Paul, and you can get in touch with them. Thanks to you three for contributing, and to everyone in the audience for sparing the time and for your questions too. Quantuma's next webinar is on Friday, the 9th of July. It focuses on the aviation industry and will consider the post-pandemic future of the sector. If you want to register for that one, go to quantuma.com/events. And also continuing is our Building Financial Fortitude program, featuring events, videos, and blogs to help firms and their advisors navigate their way out of lockdown. Details of that are at quantuma.com/fortitude. For now, thanks so much. Goodbye from me.
Thanks, James.